You had to be very good to play in the Manville Brass Band at its inception. Towards the end, there were a lot more younger people. The restrictions on who could play were less stringent. It kind of just fell apart in the 1950s and disbanded eventually. The building was sold, converted into an appliance store. It had been a jail while the band was not doing so well. They used the first floor as a jail. They rented it to the town, and it served as a police station. And it was eventually converted into a home. And up until about the 1990s, it actually had become quite derelict before the society acquired it in 1998.
The first floor of the music hall was the Huskow. It was the jail, and Alderic Peliquin was the local police officer. He was the keeper of the peace in Manville, and his office was on the first floor, and there was a couple of cells in there, and that's where the drunks slept off their overactive wrists.
The Blackstone Valley Historical Society has renovated the old music hall, and it is now used as a repository for Manville memorabilia and artifacts, especially those pertaining to the music hall. The first floor is used for the Frank A. Carter Jr. Historical Research Library, a literacy center, and a WIC distribution office. In the early morning hours of January 28, 1924, a tremendous explosion rumbled households all over the Blackstone Valley. It was heard as far away as Attleboro, East Providence, and Connecticut. At first, people thought that some type of explosion occurred at the mill, but it did not come from the mill. It came from a row of wooden mill houses on Pleasant View Avenue, just up the hill from the Manville Mill.
I was only 7 years old at the time. They woke us up, and they all went to my mother's bedroom, which is on the second floor, which gave us a good view. So my father said, "Julia, I'm going to get down and see. It looks like Pleasant View. I'm going to take a walk down." So my father walked from Minden Road right down to Pleasant View, and when he started to count the houses, the third house was his brother Mike. This was the third house in Pleasant View. They were company houses. They were duplexes. My Uncle Mike, I'm going to call him Mike, lived there with his wife, Sarah Keating. He had two sons, Emmett and Thomas, and two daughters, Lillian and Florence. Florence had gotten married a few months before the explosion, and she had moved out. So the day of the explosion, Uncle Mike said, the gas is so prevalent, he said, we can't sleep. So as Lillian said, one night they couldn't sleep. They're all standing in the kitchen. Uncle Mike, Aunt Sarah, Tommy, Emmett, and Lillian. And Uncle Mike said, "I'm going to get down and shut off the gas." But he went down there with a kerosene lantern, and the cellar was full of gas settles. The cellar was so full of gas that it ignited the whole cellar, and the whole house blew up. It took the roof off, it took the sides off. Tommy and Emmett and Lillian landed on the hillside. They were blown right out of the house. Right out of it completely, and Aunt Sarah also.
People rushed to the scene to see what happened and couldn't believe the sight that lay before them. Where a duplex family home once stood was a pile of splintered lumber. It was a scene of complete destruction, with pieces of the house impaled on tree branches and black smoke pouring out of the wreckage as it burned.
There was a family living next door. Their name was Hamill. I think there were 13 in the family, and the newspaper account says there were some boarders there also. Autopsy showed that the Hamill family were dead, asphyxiated before the house blew.
The surrounding houses were damaged as well, with the siding being ripped away and broken windows everywhere. Charles Gauthier was about 2 months old and lived in a house at the entrance of Pleasant View Avenue when the explosion rocked his crib.
And I was in a crib right next to a window, and when they came, the whole crib was filled with glass. They all rushed down to find out what happened when they had that big noise. And when they seen the window blew out and everything, and they all seen the glass in the crib filling it, was all over me. They didn't know if I was still alive or not.
Some people said that the explosion was caused by dynamite, which Mr. Hamill supposedly kept in the cellar.
It was an erroneous story. There was no dynamite.
An investigation concluded that a natural gas leak caused the explosion. A total of 15 people were killed. Michael Conway's funeral drew a procession a quarter of a mile long. He was buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in the village of Berkeley in Cumberland.
It was a tragic event. The funeral was from my father's house up here at 3415 Manville Road. Of course, it was a closed casket. I was only 7 years old at the time, but I just remember the house was full of people.
"13 members of the Hamill family died, including 11 children. During the funeral, a grim scene was witnessed by those attending as hearse after hearse was lined up in front of St. James Church. The original St. James Church burned in 1919, so the funeral was held in the basement chapel."
But when you think there was 13 in the Hamill family, the Borders, and Uncle Mike, what a tragedy it was. It was such an event that commercial photographers came up and took pictures of it, and they sold postcards in the stores around the town for 5 cents.
The Hamill family was buried in an unmarked grave.
They were buried up in St. James Cemetery. But where? There was no marker. So I took it upon myself. I said, well, I'm going to see if I can get a marker.
Jim Conway led the effort to properly honor the Hamill family. In 1999, with assistance from the Lincoln Lions Club and contributions from the public, their final resting place was marked. The disaster was listed as the worst in the state's history. The lot where the house once stood was never built on and still remains vacant today. Local and southern competition caused financial difficulties for the Manville Company. Production costs were higher than they were in the South. In 1923, the Manville Company and the Jenks Spinning Company of Pawtucket, the two biggest cotton producers in the state, merged. They combined to form a $39 million corporation with 10 mills, over 500,000 spindles, 10,000 looms, and employed 5,500 workers. The two largest textile manufacturers in the state were now one huge giant. The Manville Company operated the Norse, Globe, and Social mills in Woonsocket, the Burnin Mill in Georgiaville, and the mill in Manville. They manufactured shirtings, linings, sheeting, and fancy cotton goods. Jenks Spinning Company made auto tire fabrics in Pawtucket, Central Falls, and Gastonia, North Carolina. Life would not be easy at the Manville Jenks Company when labor disputes touched off a series of events that would help bring this giant company down. The labor movement was gaining strength, and the United Textile Workers Union was very active in organizing the workers. On August 17, 1926, the union and the workers had their first major incident. In Manville, 6 loom fixers had been replaced by non-Manville men, and as a result, the loom fixers went on strike. The superintendent told the workers in the carding, spinning, and spooling rooms that they would have to work 54 hours per week instead of 48. Everyone was ordered not to wear union buttons. The result? 350 workers joined the loom fixers. On August 18th, a general strike was called. The strike was marked by a series of violent actions. On August 31st, a mob of over 1,000 broke windows in the mill and tried to set it on fire. The company called in armored cars to transport the strikebreakers to safety. State troopers were stoned trying to clear the way for the cars. As one car headed for Pawtucket, it was fired upon by strikers.
That scared a lot of people because that was the only place they ever worked, you know? And it was getting out of hand at some time.
On September 1st, strikers clashed with state police. Troopers fired volleys of shots into the air until the bridge became a no-man's land as each side attacked and retreated. State Senator Russell Handy and Reverend Magnan of St. James Church pleaded with both sides to put an end to the violence. Finally, the militia was called in to help the police. 30 members of the 103rd Field Artillery Unit arrived at 3 a.m. and set up a skirmish line with rolls of barbed wire stretched across both ends of the bridge, with machine guns positioned on the Cumberland side. The following day, the situation in Manville was described by a reporter at the scene.
While the crowd at Manville Bridgehead last evening was small compared to the night before, the scene from the hill behind the crowd was reminiscent of wartime France. Behind a series of wire barriers and a barricade of cotton bales and sandbags, Browning machine guns stood menacingly, ready for action.
But I remember the National Guard being called out. They had sandbags set up where the bridges leading to the mill. There was a lot of violence, I understand, from what I can remember. I mean, I think one person from Manville was shot. The kids all wanted to go down there and see the men in uniform and the guns, you know, and everything. And your mother and father told you not to go over there because there could be bad trouble. Not to go anywhere near there.
Oh, that was a hot one. That's the first time you've seen the trooper run away. Things were very hot. Stones the galore. It started, the people were on strike, you know what I mean, and the troopers stopped pushing them around. And that's the worst thing they could do. So the people turned on them with stones. They ran up the Cumberland Hill. That was rough. I got out of there. Who shot a gun? A guy shot a gun. I don't remember who now. Came over at the corner of the bridge there, took a shotgun. Then the state stepped in. It was a real riot.
The bridge was nicknamed the Bridge of Death. Although no deaths occurred, there were a number of injuries. Ida Morell was struck in the leg by a stone at the Bridge of Death. John Romansky of Cumberland Hill was wounded in the hand by state trooper gunfire. A 15-year-old boy was wounded in the leg by machine gun fire at the Bridge of Death. He was operated on at home.
But I remember one time my grandparents, like I said, lived over there on Maple Street or Chestnut Street, whichever it was, and coming back from there one night, my brother the baby was in the carriage, and as we're walking on crossing the street, my father said, "Oh my gosh, it just missed me. A bullet went right through, right next to him." And they were firing at somebody down the hill, but it carried all the way up there. And so we've got to be very careful because there was so much going on down the hill.
During the strike, Henry Lippett was the president of the Manville Mill. Thomas McMahon was the president of the Textile Workers Union, and Horace Riviere was in charge of the Union strikers. State Trooper Lieutenant Jonathan Howard was blamed for the shooting orders. The governor of the state stepped in to get the two sides to negotiate. During the negotiations, the Norse Mill in Woonsocket walked out in a show of sympathy. On September 3rd, Governor Pothier announced a settlement of the strike. The mill would be in full production in 4 days, and the militia would be withdrawn. The garbage collectors employed by the company were ordered back to work as the danger of disease from decaying refuse increased. The terms were accepted on September 4th, and the governor was praised by labor for the settlement. There was an investigation as to the cause of the strike with indecisive results. It was believed that outsiders caused the trouble, but it was difficult to determine. Manville Jenks had other labor problems that were to affect but not involve Manville. The company told the workers in the social mill in Woonsocket to take on a 54-hour week or the mill would be closed and the operations move south. President Jenks told the workers that if production was not increased, large orders would be lost and the mill would have to move. The union did not agree and the social mill was closed down. The union called a strike in Woonsocket, Manville, and Pawtucket. Over 200 Woonsocket strikers invaded the State House on March 18, 1927. Manville Local 1560 refused to strike. They were afraid the mill would close and they would lose their jobs. The company promised that the Manville mill would run at full production, which meant prosperity for the village. The workers disagreed with union leaders and boycotted meetings. They felt that if mills in Woonsocket closed, it would mean more work for Manville and greater prosperity. The future looked bright in 1927, but the price of stock continued to decrease. Before the crash of 1929, the company was losing money. During the Depression, this $39 million company was $2 million in the red in 2 years. During the 1930s, the Manville Jenks Company was to dwindle away. The Manville mill closed and then reopened, but employed only 200 people as opposed to the pre-Depression level of 2,500. Prosperity returned to Manville in 1939 when work was transferred from other mills that had closed.
They had a thing called Manville Benefit Association. They took 50 cents out of your pay every week, and that covered your, there was an insurance policy. If you got hurt or killed on the job, you got compensation, a death benefit or medical expense. And they would have one outing a year where they would hire buses and they would go to Rocky Point and you could have a shore dinner on the company's time.
When I was drafted to go in the service, if I'm not mistaken, on the 3 shift, there were 3,200 people working there. 3,200 people on the 3 shifts. That was a big mill. They had 2 big mills, 2 all around.
When I went to work, it was a cotton mill. But if they switched over during the war years, I think they were weaving wool for khaki, woolen cloth. The mill worked round the clock. They had 3 shifts, 7 to 3, 3 to 11, and 11 to 7.
In 1945, Textron, a huge textile company, bought out Manville Jenks. Wages were increased and a minimum wage of 65 cents an hour was established with increased benefits for third shift workers. There were 2,000 people employed at the mill. Textron was heavily involved in southern textile production. During the late 40s, the shift to the south was massive. However, Manville was one of Textron's largest cloth producers, so instead of moving south, the mill was expanded and improved. In 1946, additional workers were hired and 700 looms were installed for the production of wool and spun rayon. But by 1948, the advantages of operating in the South were too great, and the mill closed.
Soon after they bought it, they shut the mill down, stripped it of the machinery, and moved the machinery south. And that's when I remember the wailing and the agony of the people in the village, because most of them worked in the mill. And everybody feared that their livelihood was all over.
Attempts were made to sell and lease space in the huge complex. But this gigantic mill, which had been the heart of the village, would never be the same. On the morning of November 4th, 1927, residents in northern Rhode Island awoke to the worst flood disaster in its history at the time. All during the night, howling winds and torrential rains pounded the area, and by morning there was extensive damage. Some people were flooded out of their homes. Great gullies washed across highways. Train and trolley service was halted, and bridges were undermined or washed away. A few dams let go on smaller streams feeding into the Blackstone. The Blackstone River rose 10 feet, rising at a rate of 2 inches an hour. It resembled a logging river, with all kinds of wood floating downstream, including telephone poles, planks, cordwood, and uprooted trees. Mill employees in Woonsocket reported seeing about 50 boys roping logs as they came over the dam near Clinton Street. The boys hoped to make money selling the wood. At Manville Jenks, the dam was completely engulfed by the rampaging river. This view of the dam and gatehouse was taken from the roof of the No. 3 mill during the height of the flood. The mill office roof is in the center. The section of the mill built over the river was the bleaching room. This bridge, just downstream from the bleaching room, carries a cotton conveyor pipe from the cotton house. This second bridge spans the river from the fuel oil storage tanks to the boiler room. These two men are standing next to the lumber shed near the carpenter shop. Sandbags were used to help stop the flooding. Inside the bleaching room, cloth was placed up high on racks for safekeeping during the flood and had to be sorted out when the floodwaters subsided. Spectators came to witness the damage created by the raging waters. On the afternoon of September 21st, 1938, a powerful hurricane roared out of the Atlantic Ocean and smashed its way through New England. When it hit Manville, it flattened trees, knocked over buildings, damaged the mill, and left a devastating trail of wreckage.
I remember there was the house across the street from the store had these old slate shingles on the roof. It was a 3-story house, and these slate shingles, they're very heavy, if you ever seen, and thick and that heavy. They were peeling off like pieces of paper. They were lethal weapons being blown by the wind. Some of those actually blew across the street and stuck into the house like a knife. If that had hit you, that would have taken your head clean off.
Oh, we were at home, and all of a sudden it started to get so windy and rainy, and my father had gone to work because he worked on the second shift, and we were worried. We didn't want him to go because we were scared, because going over that bridge, you know, with so much wind. But he went anyways. He said, I have to go. And he was helping people across the bridge, walking on their hands and knees. It's the only way they could cross the bridge.
I got to Manville and we got to the house. I lived on Pearl Street, and it's about halfway up the hill. And I went to look out the kitchen window, and there was a Episcopalian church down there that had 150-foot pine trees. They had like 6 of them in a row, I think. It knocked up every one of them over. Unbelievable. You could see them falling like pins, you know? Unbelievable. It was really wild, I'll tell you.
And Lorraine was a baby, and she was in the crib, and it came this big bang, and the whole house shook, and my mother had it was a big statue, and it almost fell on her head. My brother saved her from getting killed.
The 38 hurricane, we were all in the store, in my father's store. We lived above the store. So we were all in the store. And the shingles from the houses around us were just coming apart. And one hit one of the big bay window in the store. Well, the minute that hit that window, the window collapsed, and the box of cereals were riding in the store. We had to bend down not to get hit by them, you know. And my mother was in the window, and all I remember is we hollered, "Ma, get out of there, get out of there." You know, we got so scared.
It was a three-family house, and the chimney fell inside, and I mean, it made such a noise. The woman upstairs was screaming and crying, and it was very frightening.
And I was in that speeder room when that came. It was shortly after we got in the mill that started blowing real hard. And we're trying to secure the window. Then they told us get away from it because one had been blown in, and they didn't want us in front of the window to be blown on us. And finally, they released the people because they told the people to go home. And it was real difficult to cross over the bridge. The women didn't want to go, so we picked a couple of guys together with women around, so we tried to walk across the bridge. We did make it, but the women didn't dare trying to do it by themselves.
We'd see these little shacks fall down, you know, and being rolled down, and we, oh boy, look at that, and like a dog house or a little shack in back of the house. And we thought it was funny, but when we saw the windows collapse, 3 big bay windows collapse in the store, everything was sailing out.
And across the street, next door to us, Mr. Larochelle had all these beautiful cherry trees, and they were just being uprooted. I mean, it was unbelievable. We didn't know what it was. We had never seen anything like that before.
Ah, que nos pères étaient